Praise the Lord, everyone. Shine back with another video for you all. Today, I actually wanted to talk about not stopping the spread of the gospel. And the reason why I say that is because you can have people who you may not particularly care for, people who you feel like they teach a lot of other wrong things. So because of that, their gospel, the gospel that they preach, that must be wrong. And I just wanted to show why, if someone preaches the true gospel, regardless of who it is or the reason why, that as long as that gospel is being spoken of and not compromised, not to stop people from hearing that message. So I just want to showcase, biblically why, I believe, this to be so. So here in 1 Corinthians 10:23, Paul says how all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. So in other words, Paul is saying that, I can, as a believer, I still have the power to do whatever I want, whether good or bad. So I just wanted to show this verse just to show that it is very much possible for a believer to go out and preach false doctrine, even preach, a false gospel. Once a person is saved, they're sealed. They can't be undone, thank God. But that person can turn around and go out and preach false doctrine and preach a false gospel. So Paul here says all things are lawful for me, and that would include, preaching false doctrine. Here in 1 Timothy 4:1-2, he says, now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. So a person who is a believer can still be influenced demonically. And when I say that, I don't mean that they can be possessed, but you can still, have the influence of, seducing spirits, as Paul says. Just like Peter, when he basically rebuked Jesus, when Jesus said he was going to be arrested and killed, Peter said no, and Jesus said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." And he's saying this to Peter. Peter was being influenced by Satan at that point. And I'm pretty sure it's Peter, had good intentions to say, "No, Lord, we're going to protect you." But at that moment, he did not understand, I came to die for sin, and you're stopping that. You're being influenced by Satan. So we see that's just one example of a believer still being able to be influenced by Satan. So verse 2 says, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron. So a believer can turn around and preach a message that is actually contrary to what got them saved. That's very much a reality. And I think a lot of times we just automatically assume, okay, if you are preaching false doctrine, that just means that you're not a believer, you're not born again. But we're seeing here that no, it is very much possible for a believer to actually speak wrong and twisted things. So it's good not to just automatically assume things. We really got to make sure we're in these scriptures and we're trying to apply scriptures as much as possible to everything. So let's make sure that we just keep in mind, just because that person speaks wrong, it does not automatically make them an unbeliever. It doesn't automatically make them not saved. Them preaching is not what saved. It's about what they believed at some point. So if they never believed it, then yes, they're not saved. But if they did believe it, but then they did a 180 and now they're on some other stuff, as bad as what they're doing, that doesn't negate when they did believe until salvation. Okay, so Mark 9:38-40, and John answers saying, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and he followeth not us, and we forbade him because he followeth not us. Now, I think at some point we kind of all have kind of done this. Like I say I include myself, that we feel like if they're not a part of some sort of self-approved section of people or network of people that if you're not a part of this, then you're not really a believer unless you come with us. And I think this is a perfect example of that. And if we keep reading, Jesus says, but Jesus said, forbid him not. For there is no man which shall do a miracle in my name that can lightly speak evil of me. For he that is not against us is on our part. So, here Jesus is saying, look, just because he's not necessarily with us with this particular 12 of you that I picked, if he's casting out demons, in my name, do not forbid him from doing that. So just in the same way, just as we spoke a second ago, just because someone may not be a member of our church, or they might not be a member of a particular circle or group that we approve of, as long as they believe in that true gospel, what did Paul say? That it is the power unto salvation. As long as they believe that, they are part of the body. So they do not have to be a part of a particular church or a particular group of people in order for them to be a part of the body of Christ. And I think it's important to always keep that in mind. Now, let's look at Philippians 1:16-18. This is what Paul writes. He says, the one preach Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. What then? Notwithstanding every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, will rejoice. So Paul is literally saying how basically you have people who will preach Christ, some with pure intentions, others with impure intentions. But Paul says, nonetheless, if that gospel of Christ, if Christ is being preached and that message is not being twisted, regardless of the intentions of the person, and regardless of if that person is a true believer or not, as long as that message is sound, he says he's going to rejoice in it, because a person is not saved whether or not the person speaking the message is saved or not, or whether that person speaking the message is doing it for a pure reason or not. It's whether that message is sound, and then at that point, it's how they respond to the message, whether they believe it or not. So that's why Paul says it. Honestly, when it comes to the gospel, it doesn't matter who it comes from or the reason why they're saying it. He says he's going to rejoice either way, because that message of Christ is being preached. So now we're going to actually look at some believers, again, as we mentioned, who are actually speaking false doctrine. 2 Timothy 2:17-18, and their word will eat as doth a canker, of whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus, whom concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already, and overthrow the faith of some. So you have two believers who've erred from the truth, and now they're speaking, false doctrine. And some of these people have actually turned around and believed their doctrine. Now, what they're preaching does not negate whether they are saved or not. Us being saved isn't about, the gospel is as long as you're preaching the right thing. No, it's about what you believe. It's about your faith. And once you believe that, you're sealed. God is faithful even when we're not. So, here we have two believers causing other believers to actually believe false doctrine. But it does not negate, their salvation. But here we see that you can be a believer and still preach a twisted message. And you could even preach a false gospel. Now we're going to look at Acts 18:24 through 28. It says, and a certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. So here's someone who, it appears he was a believer, but it seems like his doctrine was off, because it says he was only basically teaching the baptism of John. And he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. And when he was disposed to pass into Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him, who, when he was come, helped them much which had believed through grace, for he mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly, showing by the scriptures that Jesus was Christ. So here you have a man who was a believer, who at that point he thought he was preaching the right thing. I believe this is someone who thought he was doing the right thing. He didn't have ill intentions, but like any of us, he was preaching the wrong thing. But he was doing it out of a pure heart. But still, nonetheless, we see here that a person who was a believer was actually preaching wrong. And Aquila and Priscilla came and took this person and expounded unto him the more perfect way of God. And they was preaching unto him Christ. And from there, he learned, and then he went on and he began preaching other people as well. So, here again, another believer who, is possible to, whether you're doing it for ill intentions or good intentions, can still be in error. Now, I want to bring up Judas, because Judas, he's a person who you can just use in different ways with different topics. Just as I feel Paul is someone who you can use in different ways with different topics. The Bible, if we look at John 6, Jesus told, his disciples how there was a devil in their midst. Okay, and they all were basically asking, like, who is it? And if you notice, Christ, he called him a devil, right? He said he knew the one who was going to betray him from the beginning. He knew who never was a believer. But notice that he never addressed him necessarily as a false teacher. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, as we just read how Paul in Philippians, he said, regardless of the reason, if a person is preaching the true message, I'm going to rejoice over that, because the message itself is being given out, regardless of who is coming from. So I'm going to assume that Judas, even though he didn't believe it, he was still going out and preaching the true gospel. And I say that because if he had all of the other apostles fooled, then I would imagine he fell right in line with doing the miracles, preaching the doctrine. I would even say, potentially even, casting out demons potentially, because, we see that Christ gave all 12, even the ones who will betray him, he gave all of the power to be able to, cast out demons. So in doing so, we see that actually spoke towards, the power of Christ, as opposed to say, okay, if you're a believer, then that means that as a believer, only believers can, preach sound doctrine. And in this particular case with the 12 disciples, if only a believer can actually do these miracles. But as we see, Judas was able to do all the miracles and preach the same doctrine while being a devil, while being an unbeliever. But that just shows you it's not about the person, it's about the message, it's about the source. Even to the point where Christ allowed an unbeliever to be able to do the same things of the privilege that he gave to the other true believers. That spoke to the testimony, to the message of what was being given. So I just wanted to show that, if you have someone that you say, what, this celebrity over here, this athlete over here, this musician over here, whoever it may be, if they're doing things, if they're, living a life that's not necessarily, of Christ, most definitely all of those things should be addressed. Let me make that clear. I am not trying to just say, let's just accept everybody and everything. I'm not trying to say that at all. But what I am saying is, purposefully, when it comes to this gospel, when it comes to that, if someone is indeed preaching the gospel, that's all that matters. And Paul says he's going to rejoice either way, regardless of who it comes from and the reason why. If the true gospel now, not some perverted message, but if the actual gospel is being preached, then we should not stop that. Now, like I said, when it comes to everything else, we can touch on that as well. But if there's someone who you necessarily don't agree with, but they are preaching the gospel, regardless of the reason that gospel is being sent. Just imagine, for instance, I'll just say some medicine or something like that. It could be some heart medicine or something. You could have someone who is, your own, maybe a family member or someone who does right, bring you that heart medicine. Or you could have someone who rapes people, kidnaps people, kills people, is a drug dealer, is a gangbanger, and that person brings you that heart medicine. Now, is that heart medicine going to be affected by, the person who gives you the heart medicine, or is that heart medicine going to be the same regardless of who gives it to you? That's basically the same thing. If someone is giving you something, it doesn't matter who's giving it to you, as long as that actual thing that's supposed to help you is not tainted or perverted. So that's not to excuse the person who may be, to say if they're an unbeliever or they may be a believer and they're teaching twisted stuff. I'm not saying to take those things lightly. But what I am saying is, and I keep reiterating myself, as long as that gospel is being preached, that is the thing that saves, not the person giving it. So I pray God got the glory first and foremost out of this. And I pray whoever needs to see this will see this and be blessed and edified by it. And I would love to hear your thoughts down below. I look forward to seeing you in the comment sections. Till next time, I love you all, and God bless.